Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. As mentioned, I'm Bree Harvey, Head of Market Research for Achievers, and it probably won't be long before you notice that I love talking about and thinking about how workforce science can help guide us to build a more humane people strategy when I'm not writing or thinking about HR trends. I love going on long runs around San Francisco where I live, and I'm super into Bollywood dancing. Very random. But if you aren't already familiar with Achievers, you probably won't be by the end of this presentation because today is all about you, and our only goal for our time together is for each of you to leave with at least one idea or useful tip you can use in the coming year for elevating your retention and performance strategy. But for the purposes of this conversation, only two things are relevant to note about Achievers. One is that we've been in the HR tech space for coming on 2 decades. We have a couple hundred customers spread around the globe that collectively employ around 3 million employees across 150 countries. The reason why I bring that up is because a lot of the examples we'll be talking about today come from our customer base, which represents pretty much every vertical you can think of within the private sector. But most of our customers are in the range of like having 1,000 to 300,000 employees. So if you work for a company that's smaller, I just wanted to kind of highlight that some of our benchmarks and recommendation may sound a little bit overkill to you. But we do have a dedicated research arm called the Achievers Workforce Institute that is focused on uncovering trends across the global workforce, and we publish a lot of proprietary research that accounts for companies of all sizes. And today we'll be featuring findings from a few of our latest reports, which you can check out in the resources link we'll give you at the end, as well as some teasers from our 2023 engagement and retention report that we're getting ready to publish. So now that that's out of the way, let's start by addressing how crazy it is that somehow 2023 is here and the story we're starting to see unfold sounds familiar. It feels very familiar with the heightened economic uncertainty. Budgets are restricting, and a lot of employers are still experiencing the negative after effects of the Great Resignation and the pains that come with quiet quitting. And HR is just generally being forced to do more with less. So if you're thinking about ways to recruit existing employees and you have the sense that the stakes are feeling high, you're certainly not alone. The issue is that even in the best of times, when market conditions aren't, changing at a rapid clip and employee sentiment and preferences aren't, changing overnight, it can be hard to predict what combinations of solutions and approaches will be effective for moving the needle on broad outcomes like performance and retention for a given employee population because, workforces are increasingly diverse and multi-generational, and finding a one-size-fits-most solution is getting more challenging. So, but the good news is that there are a number of themes that emerge within the literature, and today we'll talk about a couple of them and share a few predictions and recommendations that have emerged in our research, and in doing so, talk about some examples of what good looks like in the real world. Now, anytime you're talking about ways to drive productivity or really any kind of behavioral outcome, I think it's helpful to first take a step back and think about what academia tells us about human motivation in general. I think Maslow provides a pretty useful framework in that, you know, broad strokes, you can think about there being different categories of needs. And as employees move up on the hierarchy of needs and move up on the pyramid, we tend to see an uplift in engagement and by extension, performance. But if employees are preoccupied with their basic survival and safety, your efforts to satisfy those higher level needs, like having purposeful work or a sense of belonging, will be less impactful. Another way of looking at it involves distinguishing between hygiene and engagement factors. Both are important, but for totally different reasons, in that hygiene level gaps within the employee experience can cause high dissatisfaction, but can't really have a long-term impact on motivation and performance, while motivation factors, getting those right, is kind of how you tap into intrinsic motivators that are necessary for fostering long-term loyalty, resilience, and belonging. A good analogy I heard is that hygiene factors like compensation and a safe work environment can sort of be thought of as like the foundation and basic wiring of a house. If there are functional issues like a hole in the ceiling or no electricity or running water, it's going to limit how enjoyable it is to be in the house, and employees aren't going to feel like sticking around. Where motivation factors, on the other hand, are the things that make the house a home. Connection, shared rituals, and stories and meaning. And this is kind of the area where HR can manufacture the sticky stuff that makes employees keep coming back for more and energized to do their best work. So ultimately, you want to strive for both high hygiene and high motivation. But if employees are, concerned about their basic needs, then that should be addressed with more urgency, because that's kind of the price of entry for engagement. So it's okay if that's kind of where you're at, but I just want to be clear that some of the suggestions that we talk about today might be more like temporary band-aid solutions versus transformative for your culture. But yeah, like basically, since the theme of our conversation is more about driving sustainable performance and loyalty, we're kind of starting with the base assumption that those survival needs are satisfied. So we won't be getting into compensation theory, but that's not to say that there's certainly not a lot going on in that area. It's definitely an important piece of the puzzle. But if you are already in the bucket of having relatively high hygiene, the good news is that the basic recipe for building an employee experience that cultivates high motivation and high engagement can be understood by simply acknowledging that every single one of your employees just wants you to give them a reason to show up to work other than a paycheck, because we're all genetically programmed to crave feeling seen, heard, and valued by the people around us. So that'll be a theme throughout today's discussion. Let's go ahead and zoom back out to our list of data points HR should consider taking heed to if you're on the hunt to look for ways to promote high performance culture and retain your talent. We'll go ahead and double click on the top item and talk about one of the most widely circulated case studies about performance of all time. It comes from Google, where their people analytics team basically took a couple years to analyze thousands of data points to try to answer the question, like, what's the difference between our high performing teams and our low performing teams? And what they found was that there was no correlation with IQ or years of experience or how often a person made mistakes. The single most important factor that predicted performance was, does anyone feel like guessing in the chat, or let me know in the chat if you know the answer to this? Going once, going twice. There are no guesses, so I'll just tell you, it was trust. And having a psychologically safe atmosphere where people can show up to work as their most authentic selves without the fear of being judged for making mistakes. And even without looking at the gobs of literature showing how trust is fundamental for performance and engagement, it's just intuitive to us. Like nothing works without trust. Relationships, governments, our democracy, societies, organizations, and studies on crisis management show that when people are operating in VUCA conditions, meaning their environment has higher levels of volatility, uncertainty, or ambiguity, then building what Harvard Business Review calls a high trust environment becomes even more critical for motivating people to stick around and do their best work. I think that the research on the different types of trust and how they can be experienced within the context of work is pretty interesting, but there are two types of trust, I think, that are especially relevant to the engagement and retention equation. Namely, institutional trust, which is more top-down and exists at the corporate or leadership level, and relational, which is the trust between two people. So we're going to explore a few opportunities for HR to help improve institutional trust and influence productivity and attrition from the top down. And then we'll kick around some ideas for HR to enhance relational trust and strengthen team cohesion and performance. So we're going to start with our latest data set, which we collected just October of 2022, where we surveyed around 5,000 people. And one of the questions simply asked if they planned on looking for a new job in 2023. Let me know in the chat if you feel like guessing what percentage of respondents said, nope, definitely not looking for work next year. Would you guess it's 20%, 30%, 40%? Oh, Therese, 30%, 20? You are not too far off. So out of the 5,000 employees, 39% said they did not have plans to put their ear to the ground, which means that like the other 60% are either planning to look for new work or they're still not sure, which is a little unsettling. I should say that this spread of responses isn't too far off from what Adecco found in their survey, which they also did in October of 2022, but had a way bigger sample size of like 30,000 employees, which I always think is interesting. But for the 38% of employees who said, yep, I do plan on looking for a new job next year, we asked them to identify the main reason why. And would you believe it? Coming at number one, actually it was tied for number one, along with career progression, was flexibility. Whew, shocker, not really. But perhaps even more interesting was for those who said they were not planning on looking for a new job, we asked them again to select why, and the number one reason by a significant margin, flexibility. So I'm not a betting woman, and I don't want to go deep on this point because I know people already have their policies in place and, there's not much you can do at this point, but pretty much everyone's data is suggesting that flexibility is likely to be the new competitive frontier on the war for talent. It's very likely that your organization's willingness to and ability to kind of create policies that reasonably enable employees to better harmonize their life with work will significantly impact your ability to attract and retain talent in the coming year. Um, and although most businesses have an understanding that these demands for flexibility aren't going away, there's also a sense that cultural cohesion and energy levels have taken a beating and executives are tired of coming into sad, empty, low energy offices that they're paying for. And getting hybrid right, is tricky for a lot of different reasons. Not all jobs can be done from home. Employee populations are more diverse. There are conflicting, generational preferences, and landing on a one-size-fits-most solution is hard. But one thing we were surprised to see in our recent data is we could not find any correlation between engagement and intent to stay scores between the different categories of workers, meaning regardless of the number of days a person goes into the office, regardless of whether they're 100% remote or fully in person, the primary predictor of high engagement and strong intent to stay was whether employees felt like they personally had enough choice to decide when and where they work. I know that not every organization is both willing and able to abandon their office-centric cultures and practices, but if you have the sense that there's more you could reasonably do to shift perceptions with, senior executives, or there's more opportunity for you to tweak your policies around flexibility, and your end goal is to promote a high trust, high performance environment and retain good people, I'd encourage you to look for ways, of course, where it makes sense, to give employees the ultimate gift, the gift of having enough choice in deciding how they work best and giving them some agency in achieving a work-life blend that works for them. If you are hungry for more tips or ideas about optimizing performance and cohesion within a digital environment, I definitely recommend the book Remote Work Revolution, by Harvard Business professor Sadal Needley. It comes with a guidebook that leaders can use to have discussions with their team to help identify gaps that exist within their current approach. So definitely encourage you to check that out. Continuing on this theme of developing institutional trust and accounting for the fact that people are, employees are people with complex lives outside of work. I know that no one here needs to be reminded that it's been an exceedingly challenging few years for a lot of people, and it's clear that our collective mental health has taken a blow. A lot of employees seem to be working more hours, but accomplishing less. Employee disillusionment and burnout have continued to rise with record numbers of prescriptions for antidepressants and anxiety meds. And there are just so many reasons why this is a good time to be thinking more deeply and holistically about employee well-being and addressing the causes of burnout head on instead of just, reactively trying to treat the symptoms. Deloitte has some interesting work that explores the difference between employee well-being at work versus well-being in work that I think is really interesting. The way that they describe it is well-being at work could almost be thought of as traditional wellness, like offering healthy snacks or opt in to things like a step challenge or offering a course to help with financial IQ, while well-being in work actually requires designing well-being into the work itself, which can be more complicated and require more cross-functional support and alignment. But this could take the form of job sharing or policies that ensure work is distributed in a way that if someone, wants to take time off, they can actually unplug. Obviously, it's best to have a blended approach and do both. And we're going to get into some examples, but before we do, I'm curious to just kind of have a sense in the chat if you feel like you've sufficiently designed enough well-being into the work for employees. Is this something you've accounted for in your... Nope, Jennifer's like, nope, that's a hard no. Making good strides, Mary. I love that. If this is not something that is not on your radar, please don't feel bad because Deloitte's data shows that most companies aren't being intentional about this component of their wellness strategy. But I do think it's worth pointing out that the reality of our post-COVID world is that a lot of people, myself included, are struggling with feeling like they're continuously operating in a time deficit. And studies are clear that when you're chronically feeling time poor, that's associated with higher levels of depression, anxiety, burnout, and all that bad stuff. So anything you can do to reduce the amount of time that people are in that frenetic state of feeling like they're rushing from thing to thing will be helpful for the collective mental health and resilience of your workers and ultimately their productivity. If you are not in the luxurious position of being able to give more paid time off, there are lots of simple, low-cost things you can do, like putting some energy into identifying and fixing potential inefficiencies with your meeting culture or realigning on expectations and interaction norms, like what can be handled asynchronously versus what calls for a meeting. One example I love comes from Facebook, aka Meta. But basically after the pandemic, they got this feedback from employees that people were feeling overwhelmed and like there was just so many back-to-back meetings. And what they did is they rolled out a policy, which they have till this day, where all meetings at Facebook have to be either 25 minutes or 55 minutes. And it may sound like a small thing, but shaving off 5 minutes from every single meeting across a company that big does add up. It's not like a huge financial investment, but I definitely think it sends a strong message. Like, you, our employees, we care about you and your experience, and it matters to us that you don't have enough time to get water or take a break in between meetings. Like, we care about that more than the potential 5% uplift in productivity. Another good example I can think of comes from a financial services company that we work with. And basically they were getting clobbered on Glassdoor and their engagement surveys because, it was pretty bad. And they had tried a bunch of different things to try to combat that. But one of the initiatives they did that I thought was really great was called 90 Minutes for Me. And basically encouraged all employees to take a full 90 minutes during work hours every week to actively engage in self-care or do something that, puts them in a flow state or brings them joy. Of course, they put parameters around it so it wasn't disruptive, but they spent a lot of time working with their people leaders to understand kind of how improved well-being could translate into more favorable outcomes for them. And they encouraged leaders to carve out a little time on their team meetings for people to kind of share how they spent their time. And the thing I like the most about this example is they actually instructed the managers and leaders to be candid about their own journey and struggles with prioritizing self-care and reset time, which I think anytime you can get leaders modeling the behavior you want to see more of, that's obviously a super important component to any change management scenario. We are going to take a quick question after covering this next point. The session is being recorded and the slides will be available afterwards if you need to hop, no worries. But now I want to talk about the post-pandemic reality that we're facing and the fact that, a lot of people feel like life is short and I don't want to spend my precious limited time doing a job that doesn't matter at a place that treats me like I don't matter. I think some industries are feeling this a little bit more than others. Let me know in the chat if this is something you're seeing at all in your space. I think regardless of your industry, absolutely, Teresa, yes. Regardless of the nature of your work, I think injecting more meaning and purpose into the day-to-day of employees and ensuring that people see and feel the link between their personal principles and their daily contributions and the organization's mission, values, and vision, it becomes even more important for re-energizing employees and getting them, focused on the right things when you're encountering times of change. And this is not a revelatory concept. There's decades of crisis management research and studies from previous economic downturns that have long underscored this link between value alignment and overall business success. Our findings were and have remained consistent with what Gallup and others have found in, the previous crash or the last big crash of 2008, in that when organizations are able to rally employees around their mission and values, they markedly outperform competitors in pretty much every way you can think about organizational success, but most notably with retention and performance. I want to get your take on the following corporate values: respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. Let me know in the chat what is the first word that comes to mind when you see these core values. Maybe virtuous, maybe a little vague, a little fluff. I mean, on the surface, they sound honorable. They don't sound too offensive, but those were the corporate values of Enron before they imploded because of all the fraud that their employees and leaders were committing. I know it's an extreme example, but it does illustrate the reality that coming up with values and plastering them across a wall doesn't do anything to bring them meaning to employees. And most HR leaders, they get it. Like having your values in an employee manual, talking about them in a town hall or a careers page doesn't make them relevant to your frontline operations. The types of questions I've been hearing a lot from business leaders lately are like, how can you even convince a nurse who's been suffering from compassion fatigue for years to care about the mission for a nonprofit organization? Or how do you get your average call center employee who's felt chronically overworked and underappreciated for years? Like, how do we get them more emotionally invested in the broader goals and success of an organization when you sell electronic components? Those are good questions, and we've been trying to solve for them for the last 2 decades. There are a few things that have shown to be core to the process of kind of accomplishing that more transformational alignment. I'll mention a few, starting with the importance of helping employees see their impact. 2 weeks ago, I was talking to a 76-year-old part-time hospice social worker who works for a very large healthcare company here in the Bay Area. And she had just come from an in-person appreciation event where every employee was given a personalized folder which contained performance metrics like how many house visits they completed, and they centralized all of the positive feedback for each person from patient families or whatnot. And even though they were gathered, with masks in a fluorescent lit clinical setting with cafeteria food, she was sharing how meaningful it was to have visibility on that tangible impact she personally made in the lives of those families. And it helped her be reminded of why she went into the profession in the first place. And, I thought it was kind of adorable how she had shared that sometimes she thinks to herself, like, why don't I just retire fully? Because her role is so externally focused. So she doesn't have a lot of opportunity for meaningful connections with coworkers or get a lot of feedback on how she's doing. But just having that short, personalized touch point where she got to mingle with senior leaders was enough to give her the sense that her personal mission was aligned with the organization's. The issue is that although appreciation events like that can be wonderful, they're not always scalable or enough to sustain motivation levels. The only mechanism that exists to truly integrate your values into the flow of work for employees and help them see the link between their unique contributions and the bigger picture is values-based recognition that's democratized, meaning it can't be just top-down. Recognition should be free-flowing from the bottom up, side to side, and all directions, with a special emphasis on peer-to-peer, because relying solely on leaders and managers isn't enough, because even when leaders are in the same physical location as their teams, the best case scenario, they typically have pretty low visibility anyways. So when businesses enlist the help of employees to publicly call out the good work they see happening around them, and employees internalize the message that they are the stewards of the unsung heroes among them, that's when leaders can start to get unprecedented visibility into the actual work being done on the front lines, which presents a lot of rich opportunity to reinforce key behaviors. Let me know in the chat if you have already hopped on the peer-to-peer recognition bandwagon and have a tech-enabled peer-to-peer recognition program. I'm just curious to see how many of you, how much I'm preaching to the choir on this point. Yes, no, yes. Cool. Weekly and annually, I love it. So yeah, there's something to be said about having a virtual space where wins across the business are amplified and circulated in a communal, inclusive way so that everyone, regardless of where they are in space and time, can celebrate, especially during periods when there's lots of hard change, like having a live recognition newsfeed that displays all the wins happening across the business can serve as a reminder to employees that it's not all bad. One feature of our platform that's popular with a lot of senior leaders is called Boost, which allows you to double down on an existing recognition by attaching a small monetary reward to it. And a lot of our senior leaders and CEOs take our advice to reserve a couple minutes each way to kind of troll the company-wide news feed so they can boost or write comments on recognitions that stick out to them as good examples of their values in action. One kind of extreme example comes from a customer that has a really large global employee population of like over 200,000 employees. And one of their HR leaders shared a story where they had a storefront employee that received a boost on her recognition and a comment from the CEO. And I guess when she saw it, she was like crying and saying, how she never imagined that the top executive in the company would ever know that she existed, let alone take time out of his day to, call her out and for like a specific customer interaction, and cultivating more peak micro experiences like that where employees feel seen and valued for their unique contributions and kind of connected to the broader purpose of the organization is critical for snapping people out of performance slumps. Now, I know anytime we talk about recognition, it always brings up questions about rewards. And without getting too much into it, I do feel compelled to mention one word of caution when it comes to rewards. And I feel like over the last 10 years, most HR practitioners get it. Like extrinsic motivators like incentives and rewards can be tricky for a couple of reasons and tend to just have a limited and fleeting impact on performance and engagement. But when an organization inadvertently places an overemphasis on reward, it can sometimes lead to unforeseen negative downstream effects like increased entitlement, where employees feel expectant of rewards or even insulted if they feel like the award amount wasn't equivalent to their contribution, which is not good. One of the most effective ways to combat reward-centric mindsets is to decouple rewards from recognition by leading with non-monetary recognition. For our friends who have already caught on to the fact that non-monetary recognition isn't just good for the wallet, kudos to you, because the crazy thing about non-monetary recognition, I feel like sometimes gets overlooked, is that studies show as long as a recognition adheres to all the best practices we've all heard 1,000 times, it's timely, specific, and meaningful, and so on, non-monetary recognition can have a similar impact on performance and engagement as recognition that's tied to an award. What you're looking at on this slide is a cohort study we did for CVS across their global employee population, where we mapped engagement scores to non-monetary recognitions received. And we found that employees who received just one non-monetary recognition a month were 40% more engaged than those who didn't. We do typically recommend a blended approach, and we're focused on trying to ensure that our customers are aiming to hit at least 50% non-monetary recognition, but it's common to see some customers average over 70% non-monetary recognition versus monetary. But rounding out this point, I would encourage you to take heed of the fact that at the end of the day, people just want to feel like they matter and the work they're doing matters. So peer-to-peer recognition that's inclusive is pretty much the only scalable way I can think of to infuse your values into the 2-foot level of where it gets done, and is just a fantastic way to help employees see the impact they're making to the business on an ongoing basis. If you are interested in learning more about how to elevate your approach to recognition, please feel free to download our recognition optimization checklist, which has 17 questions that you can reflect on to identify potential areas of improvement in your current strategy. We will pause here momentarily for a question, but I want to kind of tee up our next point, which has to do with accepting the reality that in all likeliness, 2023 is going to be a year that is full of crazy things we didn't expect. And there are going to be times when employee perceptions and sentiment are going to drastically change overnight. And my best guess is employers who have put in the work to modernize their approach to listening and acting on employee feedback will be able to stay plugged into what employees are thinking and feeling with more regularity and more ease in the coming year, which could help them be more informed and agile with their efforts to retain and engage talent. Let me know in the chat if you feel like you have dialed in your approach to collecting and acting on employee feedback. Because if most people are good on this point, we can literally move on to the next point. Okay, Mary's like, kind of, more or less. Okay, some more than others. I feel like at a minimum, most people these days at least acknowledge that things move way too fast to rely on annual anything. And it's clear that the market has been moving away from annual engagement surveys in favor of shorter, more frequent pulse surveys for a long time, because there's a lot of data to support the idea that checking in more frequently tends to be correlated with stronger engagement and so on. However, when I look at studies like this and findings like this, I wonder how much of that is because, the employers who poll more often also tend to be the same ones that have invested in streamlining their processes and have addressed the knowledge and tool gaps that prevent leaders from being more effective at listening and taking action on feedback. So I'm not convinced that there's a magic number in terms of like you have to do this many number of surveys in a year. From what I've seen from our most successful customers is that the tools don't matter as long as you have built an effective feedback loop that enables feedback to be translated into action by the appropriate stakeholders. There has to be internally a collective understanding that listening is just the first step. The gains in trust to be made and engagement only come when employees have the sense that my leader gets it, they care, and I see their commitment trying to help make things better. So, once employees feel kind of continually let down or ignored or dismissed, and they start to collectively attach to the story, like, why do they even bother serving us? That is dangerous territory because that's the type of degradation of trust that leads to high disengagement and attrition. So survey fatigue isn't something you should be worried about. The real threat to performance and morale is inaction fatigue and continually making employees feel like they don't matter and their experiences don't matter. We'll talk about an example, what effective listening looks like, but first we're going to pause for a micro Q&A. If you have a burning question, please submit it into the Q&A panel. Cool. So we work with a healthcare customer that runs pulse surveys through our platform a few times a year, and they kind of collect employee sentiment in between surveys with our real-time feedback tool. And recently we featured their CHRO at an event, and she was sharing how the reality for healthcare workers is that sometimes they have to care for mentally sick or violent patients. And one week they were alerted to a double-digit dip in engagement levels for a particular clinic. And when they looked into it, they found that, several members of staff had been physically assaulted by a patient. And they did some listening sessions, and they were a little disturbed by how desensitized workers were to violence at work. Like, yeah, it sucks, but that's just how it is. We have patients come unhinged all the time. But that was not the attitude they wanted their people to internalize. So they facilitated a series of de-escalation trainings so that employees weren't just better equipped to deal with future potentially unsafe situations, but they were able to reiterate the message that if anyone feels even a little bit unsafe, we don't care about our wait time doubling. We don't care about that blood sample. Our number one priority is the safety of our staff. And so, yeah, that's what makes people feel seen and valued, is when they give you their feedback and you do something about it. I think that we will take this quick question here, which reads, one of our biggest challenges is that our managers are overwhelmed, and we have a lot of relatively new managers. Do you have any tips that don't require extensive training or resources to help inexperienced or overwhelmed managers appropriately react to feedback? This is such a good question, and I think that it's important to have technology that makes the process of collecting and interpreting feedback super simple for leaders and managers. But if you are stuck with the tech stack that you have, I think half the battle is ensuring that leaders understand that just repeating back what they heard and verifying with employees that they get it is sometimes enough. Just saying, hey, I hear you. I understand why you feel this way. I'm not sure what the solution is, but here are some of the ways that I'm thinking about addressing it. That can be enough to sort of mitigate some of those potential negative feelings. Thank you so much for that question. Okay, last 2 points. Now that we have explored some ways to establish institutional trust and drive performance and retention from the top down, we're going to shift our attention and talk about what can be done to enhance relational trust, particularly between people leaders and their teams. I know this is not the group to preach to about how managers can influence virtually every aspect of the employee experience, but I'm curious to know in the chat if anyone still agrees with the old adage that people don't leave companies, they leave bad managers, make them feel like they don't manage, that they don't matter. Is manager empowerment something y'all have been thinking about? If you are thinking about ways for managers to motivate and retain their people, you are certainly not alone. Manager effectiveness is, a big, meaty topic, and it has been a big theme of our research since the pandemic. Our manager empowerment model is good to reference if your resources are limited or you're able to double down on a few areas. There are 2 components of our model that I'll talk about, starting with the fact that employee development is something that cannot fall to the wayside because of budget cuts or emerging priorities. Going back to the 38% employees who said that they were definitely planning on searching for a new job in 2023, career progression was tied for the top reason. So if your organization has removed or decreased components of your compensation or benefits package, it's possible that people may be feeling like something was taken away from them or they're being asked to do more for less. And at this juncture, it's not enough to tell employees you care about them. You have to show them that you care about them as a whole person by taking an interest in their growth. Now, obviously not all managers are going to be superstar career coaches, but I think it's good to keep in mind that a little bit of effort can have a big effect. For example, one of our key findings from our last manager empowerment report was that the most disengaged employees who had the highest intent to leave were 3 times more likely to say their manager had never discussed career development with them. So even if there are knowledge and skill gaps that are preventing managers from having more effective career development discussions, just helping them understand that the mere act of them bringing up career growth with their team is associated with stronger engagement and intent to stay. So in terms of low-hanging fruit, I definitely think it's worth taking the time to set expectations with your people leaders, that regularly initiating development conversations with their people is a part of their essential duties and one of the best ways to snap people out of a productivity slump. The final non-negotiable for helping managers strengthen trust and productivity we're going to talk about has to do with ensuring managers understand that the more grateful leaders consistently lead stronger performing teams that are less stressed and less likely to hop ship. When we map manager frequency with intent to say scores, we see a clear correlation. We have a lot of examples like this one, which comes from a retail customer of ours where we found that locations with the highest manager recognition levels had 40% lower turnover. And this is, pretty consistent across every sector we work with. Manager recognition is a key predictor and driver of all kinds of outcomes. And generally in this day and age, like most people leaders have the sense that, recognition is an important part of leadership. But when you look at how many employees feel like that they aren't appreciated for their work, you can see that there's a disconnect. I think that this can be explained by the fact that there's a number of misconceptions leaders carry about recognition that can be harmful. One of the most prevalent is this notion that regularly recognizing employees is laborious and time-consuming work. If you have managers who feel like they don't have enough time to frequently notice and acknowledge their team's efforts, it can be helpful to just educate them about the fact that recognition isn't just about celebrating big accomplishments. At the end of the day, when people say they want more feedback, they're usually talking about a need for more clarity about whether they're focused on the right things. So everyone, not just leaders, should know that recognition should be just as much about celebrating exemplary results as it is about amplifying incremental growth and the small wins that lead to meaningful progress. Basically, expressing gratitude should be viewed by leaders as an opportunity for them to show employees that they're the type of leader who's paying attention and is committed to giving credit where credit is due, no matter how busy they are. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time. It can literally be 2 sentences, but it does have to be specific about describing why that behavior matters or what impact it had. So if you want more detail about how to improve leader and manager recognition, check out the follow-up resources, which Paul, I'm going to ask you to put in the chat now because we are coming up on time, and I sure hope you don't feel like this because we covered a lot. I'm going to attempt to tie everything in a nice little bow as I go through some of the key themes and takeaways we covered. Let me know in the chat which one of them you found the most useful, starting with the fact that the decisions you make now around flexibility and providing employees with agency and working how they prefer will likely impact your ability to attract and retain talent in the coming year. Then we addressed why burnout requires building employee well-being into the flow of work for employees. We explored some of the research on why value alignment is especially key during periods of disruption and the role of values-based recognition that's democratized and transparent. We talked about employee listening and why that should be all centered around acting on the feedback and why focusing on employee development may be helpful in mitigating regretful losses and energizing employees over the next 12 months. And finally, we kind of kicked around some ideas about employee manager recognition and how leaders can influence strategic outcomes and why it's a good idea to dismantle some of the myths that exist around employee recognition. Please feel free to subscribe to the Achievers Workforce Institute if you'd like to get a copy of our 2023 Engagement and Retention Report once it drops, or feel free to email me directly if you're interested in participating in any of our focus groups or research. One last thing before I pass it over to Paul, I have a big favor to ask. It would mean so much to me if you gave me 30 more seconds of your life and let me know what you thought of today's program. I honestly love talking about this stuff, but the only thing I care about is providing insights that you find useful and valuable. So if you have any suggestions of what I could have done to make this a better use of your time, please let me know on the survey. I get the best ideas from this audience, and I cherish every single comment. I'd love to hear from you directly on LinkedIn about suggestions for future topics, and would love to stay connected. Paul, I feel like that's all I have. I feel like we don't have time for one last question, do we? Paul's finding his
Take
mute
myself
button.
up. Mute? Yeah. Yeah, we actually have time for one more question for anyone who doesn't have a hard stop. It asks, does your data show a difference in employee expectations and engagement within small versus large organizations?
Ooh, variances based off of employee size. That is such a good question, and I didn't address this up front, so I'm glad that it was asked. Like basically, we do see some important variances. Today I was just kind of talking about our global aggregate data because I wanted it to be as universally applicable to everyone as possible, but there are like when we look at how things change based off of industry, employee size, and employee demographics, there are, like the pain points vary. I would say in general, there are more similarities than nuances. But yeah, like one example that I've been thinking about a lot recently came from so in our most recent data set, that question that I kept referencing in the presentation, like, are you looking for new work? For some reason, like when we look at employee size, there's something going on with companies that have between 500 and 1,000 employees because they had like way higher intent to leave. Like, it was like 10% higher than the average. So instead of it being like 38%, it was like almost 50%. And so, yeah, I don't know what that means. If you have a theory, I'd love for you to hit me up on LinkedIn and let me know. But yeah, I kind of, when we look at large organizations and how they kind of fare through the pandemic, they tend to be like slightly more resilient when we look at engagement and intent to stay. And so, yeah, when we think about that sort of mid-size company, it makes me wonder, like, is there a point when a company can be like like big enough that they can't be agile, but yeah, I don't know the answer, but it's a really good question. And if you'd like to know more information, you can hit me up on LinkedIn afterwards. Thank you.